So the live comments, they'll
Right.
come up.
So we're going live now. So thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Andy, for your presentations, and a big welcome to all our participants who are joining us live. And if you haven't already submitted a question, please do so using the blue Ask Our Panel a Question box. And you'll find this at the top right hand of the event page. And if we can't address each question in this live session, our panel will address these in a subsequent discussion document. But now it's over to some of the questions. And our first question today is from Tim. And Tim says, we've started a WhatsApp group on our street to make sure everyone's okay and do shopping rotas, etc. I've lived here 5 years, but only really got to know my neighbours since joining the WhatsApp group. Do you think we'll see more spontaneous street volunteer groups emerging in the future? So, Andy, Duncan, any thoughts on that comment and question from Tim?
Sure. Shall I go first, Andy?
Okay. Yeah, please.
So, in response to Tim's question, I think a lot of people have been feeling like that. They've been living in their streets, and now although during lockdown, it almost seems counterintuitive that they're getting to meet and to meet their neighbours even more. I think that in specific response to the question, yes, there will be more street volunteer groups. There has been an overwhelming response of activism at the very local levels, people understanding that their neighbours are in need, that their neighbours, and learning about what those needs are, and realising that they have a role and can take a very substantial and active role in helping them when they're in need and helping them in their vulnerabilities. So I don't think we'll go backwards from this. I think that we will step forwards. Obviously, as we begin to put governance around some of these street groups, then that might change their nature ever so slightly. But will we go backwards? I hope not. I believe not. And there are lots of activities that the volunteers can still do even after the COVID situation is beginning to abate and resolve itself.
Thank you, Duncan. Andy, any response for Tim on that?
I think I just agree with what Duncan's saying. I think I hope people are feeling really empowered. Certainly in Cumbria, we're witnessing people coming forward and being very engaged in a way that they haven't done before. I think also the way the structures have been created in Cumbria, the police, the local authorities have positively welcomed and embraced, community self-help in a way that you might not necessarily have expected. So I think that's a big credit to how the statutory sector has responded in the county, and I think the conversations within the recovery groups about how do we keep working with these organisations, but I think they are independent. They've got their own mind on each street. Everyone's going to come up with their own decisions, and the heart of good volunteer management is letting them set their own agenda, not anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. And we have our next question from Joyce. And bearing in mind the dynamic situation we find ourselves in currently, Joyce is asking, how do you prioritize who needs help in a rapidly changing situation? I don't know, Andrew, from your own perspective of having to pivot whilst dealing with vulnerable people, but suddenly you find a new batch of people. Do you want to start with this one for Joyce? How do you prioritize who needs help in a rapidly changing situation?
Well, the Community Foundation has an advantage in that it's a very local funder with a lot of knowledge, both in terms of conversations with groups, with the sorts of people who sit on our grants panels are in their own communities. But also we have got a long history now of being part of the local Resilience Forum and their either recovery groups or resilience groups. So it's absolutely essential. We set criteria and priorities early on. We have FAQs on our website, but our grants officers are speaking with groups all the time. And it's really important for us. We constantly, so at the moment we're making grants every week. We're in conversations. We've got 6 resilience groups in the county. We've got representatives on each. I sat in on our grants meeting yesterday afternoon. There's a constant live feed. So we are always updating information. We also, I think I set out in my presentation, actually set out frameworks and expectations within our grant strategy of what we'd expect to see there. But say, for instance, to use a live example, we haven't seen anything quite as universal and as significant as the pandemic, even though Cumbria has had a pretty horrific history of disasters. So say, for instance, we wouldn't have necessarily predicted the high levels of just food poverty and food need, but we've been able to flex to that and respond to that. So it's just a case of being nimble and constantly reviewing it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrew. Our next question is from Amanda.
Sorry, may I just respond to that as well, Stephen?
Yep.
I think that one of the interesting things about the response has been the number of volunteers that we've had being offered. So 750,000 volunteers to the NHS responders, countless volunteers across local authorities and right down, as you say, to the grassroots. And so the demand has been slightly lower than we expected. And so because of that, there has been excess supply of volunteers, which has meant that almost everybody who has requested help has been able to receive that help. And so some of the daily requirements that have come forth have been able to be serviced, and the voluntary organisations haven't had to make the decision between person A and person B because they've had such a marvellous response from the volunteers.
And from your experience, Duncan, do you think that's something unique to COVID-19, or just think it's scalable with any kind of emergency response? That kind of.
I think it is unique.
Yeah.
I think it is unique. I think that I've been working in spontaneous volunteers for 8-9 years, and across the world, I've never seen this number of volunteers come within such a short period of time. A national response, a national cry for help, and that has been responded to. Normally, emergencies incidents are geographically bound and they are located in a particular area. And so here we've got a national issue rather than a local or regional issue, which has meant that the number of volunteers has just been extraordinary.
And yeah, just to add to that, we've got in Cumbria, the Support Cumbria website, more volunteers than voluntary organisations can use. So if there's any voluntary organisations out there who aren't aware, go on there and make use of it. And again, I referenced some of the community recovery groups, and I know that they're using their volunteers in shifts because they've got twice as many people than they need. And it's just absolutely, it's remarkable. There's lots of negatives out of this pandemic, but this is a real positive that we should celebrate.
Yes. And one of the challenges will be, how do we retain that? But I realise that Stephen wants to go on to the next question. So
that's absolutely right. I was just going to say as well, one of our Colonel David Bates, who presented on our first session looking at a history of pandemics, he made the point that we're actually, as an initiating event, a pandemic, we are only as strong as our weakest link. And looking at nations beyond our community, beyond our shores, this has to have a global effort to deal with this. So how we take this from voluntary sectors overseas as well. And I know we have some people on the call who are working in some quite difficult conditions overseas now, trying to deal with this amongst refugees and other people as well. So yeah, I think the voluntary sector is going to have a huge role to play in this going forward. Sorry, I'll let you finish, Duncan, what you're going to say.
No, maybe move on to the next question, and then I can perhaps respond.
Okay, well, it leads neatly on to Amanda's question. What do you think is the biggest change COVID-19 will make on the voluntary response sector? That's from Amanda. What do you think the biggest change COVID-19 will make on the voluntary response sector?
So I think it's important to probably look at the community response and the charity response as two separate things. So we've talked about spontaneous local organisations organised through Facebook groups and other sort of social media channels. They may choose over time to become more formal, or they may just continue to be informal. I think it's really important to recognise the role of just being a good neighbour And one of the things that the pandemics enabled people to do is giving them permission to overcome, in England, perhaps some of their reticence, if such a thing, existed. It's been okay to reach out and support people. So I think a significant change is empowering those people, and that's a social change. But then I think if you actually look at the charity sector, so these are formally constituted organisations who were already existing, perhaps serving the needs of elderly people or the disabled. There might be a Citizens Advice Bureau or an Age UK organisation. Some of those organisations, very sadly, because of the funding challenges, may go. That's one trend that we will see. And that's a really, really significant issue. I think others will adapt how they work. We've already funded, training costs, IT costs, tech changes in terms of how services are delivered, and those will be positive efficiency savings. But I think others will also look to use volunteers differently. And I think the final thing I'd say is my experience locally is really good collaboration. And I hope we'll see that continuing to the future, because unfortunately, the social and economic needs or the hardship needs generated by the pandemic are going to absolutely put these organisations at the forefront of supporting our communities for the next 18 months, 2 years and beyond. It's not about emergency, it is about emergency response at the moment, but the longer term needs are significant and those organisations need to be there.
Thank you, Andrew. Duncan, would you like to offer anything for that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Andy on the pain that the charity sector is going through at the moment. They have the income coming in isn't what it used to be. The expenses are still what they were and are even growing in terms of providing services to more and more people. And so there is huge pain that's currently being endured. And I absolutely agree that pain needs to be acknowledged and funded in order to support the charity sector and the voluntary organisations to make sure they are there. Because one thing that we know for absolute sure is that vulnerable people will still be there and will still need the voluntary sector to provide essential services. At the moment, in some instances, the local authorities have stepped in to provide support, but those local authority staff will need to go back to their previous employment, their previous roles, and that could, if we're not careful, leave a void. The charity sector is well placed to support that, and so we need to start easing local authorities out of those roles and easing voluntary sectors into those roles, but making sure that those are, in my view, should be commissioned services, that they are taking on a responsibility, and that in commissioning the charity sectors to do that, they are being able to be supported. A different slant is that the charities, the voluntary organisations, have perhaps struggled in the last few weeks, certainly, to accept, to register, to induct all of the volunteers that they've been receiving offers of support from. And so we have, as we've talked about before, this large number of volunteers, and they're now in the volunteering mind frame, and we need to keep that and encourage that, and that will be one of the major significant changes, as the question asks, that how do we encourage volunteers who want to move from the informal volunteering over to more formal volunteering to support the charity organisations as they are commissioned to do those services. So almost there's two sides to the story. We need to support the charity sector, but the volunteers need to support the charity sector as well, providing them with the support to be able to deliver those services.
Duncan, thank you for that response. Our next question is from Ian. And Ian says, a review into Operation Fincham, the investigation into the deaths of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman in 2002, criticised the preparedness of investigators for a wave of search volunteers following a public appeal for information. Is it possible to forecast public responses to particular types of event? Duncan, would you like to share your perspective with Ian on that?
I think it was not possible to forecast the number of people who would respond to the NHS call, nor to the local authorities' calls and the voluntary sector organisations' calls for support. I think that has been absolutely overwhelming. And when we have been trying to forecast how many volunteers would come, I've had conversations across government that says, well, we might get a few hundred, we might even get 1,000. In other countries, they've got thousands coming to an incident, but here we've had hundreds of thousands. So in terms of the response to COVID, it has been unpredictable in terms of number of people, I think, who have come. In terms of other incidents, I wouldn't expect that we will go back to having hundreds of thousands people responding, because again, those are probably more likely to be local incidents, important but still local. In terms of the question asks about search and volunteers being put in the position of searching for people. I get asked this a lot, and I always find it quite a difficult question to answer, because the police have control. And because of that, they need to preserve the areas that they need to preserve, because they're not quite sure what is going on in the situation. And so volunteers in that context need to be managed, and I use that term, managed, very carefully, so that the priorities of swift finding of the missing people is encouraged, but it needs to be done with care.
Thank you, Duncan. Andy, just one for yourself. Oh, you're muted, Andy. Hi, Andy. Just for yourself, obviously in the Cumbrian context as well, and Duncan, feel free to add this as one. Again, when we were starting this series, we were looking at a number of climate-initiated events as a topic to discuss around. We've had significant experience, sadly, in with flooding and response to flooding, and loss of life as well as a result of that. And we've taken lessons learned from that, and it's important we take those lessons, we learn from them, and we move on to better ourselves and make ourselves more resilient going forward. And so what we found from Cumbria, there's been a number of lessons that have helped shape national doctrine in how we respond to flooding going forward and how communities go forward. How can we, at this time when we're, if we can use the term mid-flight, what should we be recording now with regards to learning from experience from COVID going forward, the lessons we can take to ensure as we go forward, we're going to be better placed to weather what comes, Andy and Duncan, from your perspectives of learning from previous events?
Well, I think in Cumbria, our sort of tragic history means, I think we've already got a learning culture. The partnership working it's a genuine sort of privilege to be, in some of the, I know talking to peers and other community foundations, they don't necessarily have that same access to local resilience forums. They aren't necessarily treated as equal partners. And we have that here, we have relationships that have been built on, we've got structures that have been built on. And so we're already, capturing information and knowledge. Fortunately, Cumbria is a very nice place to be. So those of us who come here don't tend to leave. So that is, not every community can benefit from the sort of stability that our organisations have. But we wouldn't have the structures that we have got if we didn't have that learning culture already.
Thank you, Andy. Duncan?
I think learning has been happening since before this really hit our shores. So we've been learning from all over the world as to how they are responding to the challenges of COVID and how they are now recovering from those challenges. So we are constantly identifying lessons and bringing them back into the UK so that we are not reinventing the wheel. And as Andy says, we can learn from past incidents, but we can also learn from others' experience of this incident, because there is so much that's happening. Every country, bar a few, have been affected by this, and they have been very generous in sharing their information, and we need to learn from that as well as learn from our own experiences, as well as share our own experiences in forum like this.
Duncan, thank you for answering that question. Well, that is all we have time for this week. I'd just like to thank everyone for all your questions, and thanks to Professor Shaw and Andy Beeforth for your insight today, and also just like to thank both of you for using your skills to serve the vulnerable people in our communities now and moving forward as well. And to conclude, I'd just like to put a question to our participants. How have the conversations you held changed over the past few months on a professional and personal level? And on this journey of becoming we're talking about, is there a path we can walk during times of heightened tension that can enable more powerful conversations which bring about change? Well, these are some of the issues we'll be considering in our next session, when we'll be joined by Dr. Andrew Brown and Karen Chubb for Crisis Talks. Now, Andrew is an internationally renowned hostage crisis negotiator with experience of securing the release of hostages in the Afghan and African context. He currently serves as a director for the Emergency Planning Society and is chief security officer for the Jesuit Refugee Service, overseeing their missions to refugees in a number of hostile countries. And he will be sharing with us something of the behavioral change staircase that we need to learn to navigate during times of crisis. And perhaps one of the most important conversations we can hold during times of crisis is actually the conversation we hold with ourselves. And to that end, Karen, who is a senior lecturer in coaching and leadership here at the University of Cumbria, she'll be sharing her perspective on how we can hold those healthy internal conversations with ourselves during times of crisis. Do read more about them on our events page. And remember, resilience isn't an endpoint, it's a journey. Finally, stay safe and see you next time.